Good evening, everybody. I'm Betsy Fischer Martin, the Executive Director of the Women in Politics Institute at American University, and welcome to our virtual series, Women on Wednesdays. We are glad you could join us this evening. To those of you new to one of our events, WPI is a nonprofit and nonpartisan institute in AU's School of Public Affairs that aims to close the gender gap in political leadership. Now, we offer academic and practical campaign training, and we facilitate research and discussions like this on women in politics and leadership. And we are so pleased to be co-hosting tonight's conversation with the First Ladies Association for Research and Education, otherwise known as FLAIR, and AU's First Ladies Initiative, which seeks to highlight the significant contributions of America's First Ladies. And there is no doubt that the subject of tonight's discussion, Edith Wilson, is among the most influential and powerful presidential spouses in history. In fact, for several months from late 1919 to the beginning of 1920, she became the most powerful woman in the nation, and we'll talk about that. Some would even describe her as this country's first female president in many ways. Yet there is so much that we don't know about Edith Bowling Galt Wilson until now, thanks to our guest tonight, author and educator Rebecca Boggs Roberts, who has just written a thoroughly reported new biography of the second wife of our 28th president, Woodrow Wilson. The book is titled Untold Power, The Fascinating Rise and Complex Legacy of First Lady Edith Wilson. Before we start, I want to let you know that we will save plenty of time for some questions at the end, so please feel free to type those in the bottom during the course of our discussion. And as I mentioned, we are happy to be co-hosting this Women on Wednesday with the First Ladies Initiative at AU, and especially thrilled that the director of the First Ladies Initiative, our friend Anita McBride, is here tonight as well. Anita, as I'm sure many of you know, is the former Chief of Staff for First Lady Laura Bush, and earlier in her career was the Director of Presidential Personnel for Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush. Anita, let me have you set the stage a bit for our discussion tonight and just talk about what we can learn from the study of First Ladies and their significant contributions to our history.
Thank you so much, Betsy. I'm really thrilled to be here with you tonight and with Rebecca, and to have our First Ladies Initiative and FLAIR partner with you on this great discussion. I'm looking forward to this. And just a little bit of background about why the First Ladies Initiative was established at American University about 11 years ago. And it is the only university in the country that has an entire initiative associated with this topic of studying First Ladies, their impact on our history, their impact on our politics, which you'll hear about tonight, our public policy, and our global diplomacy. So we have been the convener of some of the nation's best experts on this topic, those who have worked for First Ladies, those who have followed them, covered them in the media, written about them, scholars and their books, like you'll hear from Rebecca tonight, and from First Ladies, actually, and former First Ladies and presidents themselves. So we're very proud of our initiative. AU has a long history of hosting First Ladies at the university since Eleanor Roosevelt. So we are the perfect convener. I invite all of your viewers to look at our website, american.edu/First Ladies, that has the 11 years worth of these fabulous conferences and conversations about First Ladies. This is a role that has no job description. And we hear in our initiative and through FLAIR, the First Ladies Association for Research and Education, which really does seek to have the best scholarship highlighted about First Ladies, we hear in their own words, through their biographies, through the stories about them, how they handled this job, how it was thrust upon them. Some are more skilled than others coming into politics. Edith Wilson, you'll hear from Rebecca, was not. This was thrust upon her, but she certainly used the platform in an incredibly powerful way, in a way that most Americans do not know until now, and in this fabulous book. So I'm grateful to you, Betsy, for hosting this tonight. I'm grateful to you, Rebecca, for writing such a phenomenal book. And we are very happy to help promote it and share it. It'll be on our website of all the best scholarship on First Ladies. We'll add it to our bibliography. And so I'm looking forward to the conversation. This is an important topic in American history. These women are due their place, and you're helping to do that. So have a great conversation. I'm really looking forward to it tonight.
Thank you. Thank you, Anita, so much. So Rebecca, let's get started. And I sort of wanted to start where the bookends of the book, where you end the book and where you begin the book, with Edith Wilson by her husband's side. You write at the very end, she would go on to become the most powerful woman in the nation. She would go on further to pretend she was nothing of the kind. So we have this, we have this sort of double issue here of she's so powerful, but yet she didn't seem to seek it, and she sort of demurred from making that public in many ways. Take us back to this time of October 1919, when Woodrow Wilson, her husband, has this stroke.
So he had been ailing for most of that year. He had gotten quite sick in Paris while he was negotiating the peace treaty. It was 1918. There was a flu epidemic. He caught a flu. And then when they came back to the States and he was really battling the Senate, the Republicans had taken control of both houses of Congress in the 1918 midterms, and they were blocking ratification of the treaty. And he was unwilling to compromise. They were unwilling to compromise. It was really an impasse. And the president hit on this idea that the only way out of this impasse was to take the issue to the voters. He was going to take a cross-country train tour and convince everyone of the righteousness of the League of Nations. And it was a terrible idea. Everyone knew it was a terrible idea. You don't take a sick man and put him on a really hot train car and truck him around the country. And as day follows night, he collapsed on the train. The train tour was canceled. They rushed back here to Washington. And a week later, as you say, in October of 1919, he suffered a massive stroke. His entire left side was paralyzed. His life really did hang in the balance for a good week. Even after he was out of mortal danger, he was a very sick man. And as Edith tells it in her memoir, which has its own agenda, as memoirs do, but her version
I want to talk about that.
Right. Her version is that the doctors came to her and said, he can't face any stress. He can't hear any bad news. He can't even really get out of bed. If he does those things, he's going to die. So what does a president do? A president faces stress and hears bad news and gets out of bed. So if he does all of the things a president needs to do, he's going to die. But meanwhile, he can't quit, because the only thing he's living for is to see the League of Nations. And so if he quits, you've taken away his only motivation for improvement. So if he stays president, he'll die. If he quits, he'll die. And P.S., if he dies, there'll never be world peace. That was the stakes that she was given. So in her mind, the only thing she could do was do his job for him until he was better enough to do it himself. That's, of course, preposterous. Nobody elected Edith to anything. But that was the course she undertook. She conspired with his doctor, Cary Grayson, and his secretary, functioned as his chief of staff, Joe Tumulty. And the three of them kept it secret how sick he really was. They lied to the public and the press and the Congress and the cabinet and the vice president and to the president himself. He never really understood how sick he was. And in the meantime, it was Edith who decided who saw him, who was almost no one. She responded to any issues that came before the executive branch. She drafted public statements. She communicated with diplomats. She made decisions about the cabinet. For months. This was not a kind of couple of days while he got back on his feet sort of a situation. This was really the better part of the end of 1919 and 1920. And she felt justified doing that because she was doing what was best for her husband and kind of nation be damned, although she did truly believe that Woodrow Wilson remaining president was also good for the country. And as you say, she swept a lot of it under the rug and really minimized her own role. And so you have to kind of plow through her own smoke and mirrors to figure
Right.
out what her story really is.
And it wasn't that she was power hungry. Everything she did in her life from when she married him was really in service to him and protective of him, right?
Right. I mean, she wasn't some Lady Macbeth seizing the reins for her
Yeah,
own agenda.
right.
Yeah, no, that's not fair. I think that, and she didn't necessarily do anything differently than he would have done. She knew his priorities pretty well. It's not
Right.
like she went rogue with the power.
Right.
I will say that keeping him in isolation and not telling him any bad news had its effects, right? So even if she was consulting his judgment on everything, and she clearly wasn't, not on everything, but even if she was consulting his judgment on everything, at some point his judgment wasn't great because he didn't have all the facts.
Right.
And so, you know, she had to sort of dance on this very fine line that what she was doing was justified. She was the right person to do it because she was one of his closest confidants. She knew his mind. She knew his political priorities, which she absolutely did. And, you know, was it appropriate for her to kind of continue his policies in his name if he ultimately, you know, would have done the same thing? But meanwhile, it wasn't that big a deal. She was just, you know, acting as the steward.
And it's hard to imagine in this day and age, the notion of a president really not being seen or heard from for 5 months. Obviously, that could not happen in this day and age. But back then, right, she did have to pull off some acting skills, and you open the book in the introduction with this incredible scene of a cast of characters at play, literally theatrics, when you know, he had some visitors from the Hill who were kind of suspect of what was really going on, and created the situation that they would be kind of popping in to see him. And tell us about the scene and how they were able to.
Yeah, it's just bananas. When I first read that, so there were some grumblings in the Senate that the president hadn't been seen, and his own Secretary of State, Robert Lansing, who was not a great fit for that administration and not the president's biggest fan, was sort of fed up with all of it. This is December of 1919. So he's been sick for a few months. And Lansing admitted that he hadn't consulted the president about anything. And in fact, as far as he knew, no one had met with the president about anything in months. And that then triggered this Senate visit to go eyeball the president. It was nominally about a kidnapping in Mexico, but it was really, as the president called it, a smelling committee. Yeah. And they propped him up in bed. I mean, it's got all of the makings of a farce. You know, he couldn't sit up in a chair. His whole left side was useless. So they sort of wedged him up in bed and put a blanket over his left side so that it wasn't clear the extent of his paralysis. They lit the chairs the senators would sit in quite brightly, but kept the bed in shadow so that you couldn't really get a good view of anything. Staged this report about the Mexico situation next to his good right hand.
I love that, kinda, sitting on the bedside table.
Right? I mean, just prop sitting right there, and kind of cross their fingers and hope for the best. It could have gone either way. He definitely had times where his speech was quite slurred and he had trouble following the conversation. And the senators walk in and Edith insists on being there in the room. And Senator Fall from New Mexico says, "I've been praying for you, Mr. President." And the president says, "Which way, Senator? Ha ha." And everyone thinks, okay, it might be okay. It might be okay. And they pulled it off. Astonishingly, they pulled it off. For the amount of time that the senators were in the president's bedroom, they really did not have a sense of how sick he was. And because, of course, the entire Washington press corps had gathered in the portico downstairs, they then went and told the press that the president was fine, in giving him like higher marks than he really deserved. Even Edith sort of crowed that they said he had his use of his left hand, even though that was totally useless. So it was quite, you know, to use a very lowbrow analogy, sort of Weekend at Bernie's moment, where they just stuck him up there in
That
bed
is
and
the
hoped
image
no
that
one
came to
really
my
noticed.
mind, honestly, reading it. And you have in the book a photo here too from, I guess, a couple of weeks later. And this is acting, and a posed photo meant for those very purposes, to kind of convince the public that he was, doing his work and perfectly fine.
Yeah, by spring of 1920, the fact that he hadn't been seen in public for 5 months. This is not the same as just not being super accessible. People were starting to grumble about it. And so they staged a interview with a friendly reporter who was only going to ask the questions that they approved, and staged this photo. And Edith is actually holding that paper steady so that the president can sign it. He was not steady enough to be able to do that without her help. And this image is the cover of a couple of different biographies of her, because it shows her looking over his shoulder in that very watchful way. I actually chose not to use it because I wanted to foreground her, not him. But it is quite a moment in history.
Yeah. And take us back to the Edith story of how they meet. His wife had passed away. He was a widower. Her first husband had also died. How do they come together? Tell us a little bit about that story of how she became Mrs. Wilson.
Yeah, so this is why I really enjoyed getting to know Edith Wilson. If you are surprised by how she acted after his stroke, you kind of weren't paying attention. She had really barreled her way into situations that she wasn't necessarily prepared for, and just trusted her own opinion and exuded self-confidence. And she was kind of a fake it till you make it sort of character throughout her life. And so even though she had grown up without a lot of formal education, 6th of 9 kids in the foothills of Appalachia, she had come to Washington as a teenager. She had an older sister who lived here who was married. And she married a man who ran Galt's jewelry store, Norman Galt. And they had one baby that only survived 3 days, so no children. When he died in 1908, she inherited Galt's. So that was unusual for a woman in 1908 to have her own business like that, and to have independence over her own wealth in that way. And she was really good at it. She became this sort of wealthy widow about town. She was a figure of style and substance and independence in a way that was pretty hard for women to be in 1908. So that's who caught the eye of the president, this stylish, independent widow. So he was elected in 1912. His first wife, Ellen, died in 1914. He was, by all accounts, heartbroken. They had been married over 30 years. They had 3 adult daughters. And the daughters when he had come to the White House, they were young, unmarried adults. 2 of them had since gotten married and moved out. The third wanted to be a singer. So she was kind of off on tour trying to make a career for herself. So Wilson was left to kind of rattle around the White House alone. His cousin, Helen Bones, was there, serving in whatever capacity needed to be for First Lady. There wasn't a lot of First Ladying going on in a White House in mourning, but for the things that really couldn't be avoided, Helen Bones was doing them. But she was lonely too, and she was also in mourning.
This is her.
That's Helen, yes, on the left, Carrie Grayson, the doctor, in the middle, and Nell Wilson McAdoo, the youngest daughter. They're there at the races. And so it was actually Carrie Grayson, that gentleman in the middle, who was Woodrow Wilson's doctor and a good friend of Edith's, coincidentally. And he was worried. His patient was depressed. And he went to Edith and said, "Will you please make friends with Helen Bones? They're so lonely and sad. They could really use a friend. Can you just go be nice?" And she said, no. She said, I don't want any part of official Washington. I'm a local Washingtonian, and he said, you don't need to be part of official Washington. There's nothing official going on. Just take her for a walk in Rock Creek Park. Just go be nice. So Edith did, and Edith and Helen became friends, and they would generally go take their walks and then go back to Edith's house in DuPont Circle for tea. And one day Helen insisted that they go to the White House for tea instead, which is surprising. Helen wasn't an insistent type. And Edith was embarrassed. Her boots were all muddy. She didn't want that to be her introduction to the White House. And Helen said, you won't see anybody. We'll take the elevator to the private quarters. We'll, who cares that your boots are muddy? It'll be fine. No one will see you. So they go to the White House, muddy boots and all, and it's a total setup. The elevator doors open and there's the president and Carrie Grayson, and they all have tea together. And let me tell you, it was really love at first sight for the president. He was just gobsmacked from really that very first moment. She took a little while longer, but he was all in from the second those elevator doors opened.
And you have these letters between the two.
Oh, the letters. Yeah.
And you write about flirting by policy analysis and the fact that what she's really drawn to is not the sugary sweet component of the courtship, but getting to talk about current events and policy with him. In fact, you quote one of the letters that she writes back. She says, as much as I love your delicious letters that would make any woman proud and happy, I believe I enjoy more the ones in which you tell me what you are working on, the things that fill your thoughts and demand your best efforts. For then I feel I am sharing your work.
Right. And this, she did not have a political background. She's not someone who came up through politics with her spouse, but she showed this interest from the very beginning. And, the letters are fantastic because, first of all, they just give you such a glimpse into what these people's personalities were like, because they weren't curated for a public audience at all. They didn't know I'd be reading their mail. And his letters are gushy, fervid, romantic, over the top. His heart breathes for her and he wants to kiss her eyelids, and it's on and on. And she's writing back saying, so what are you going to tell Germany about the Lusitania? What's going on with the Carranza government in Mexico? He proposed marriage 5 weeks after they met. She turned him down. She didn't feel like they knew each other well enough. The very next day, so he has just poured his heart out to her and proposed, he writes her this just absolutely, gushy letter. She writes back, we were having a really interesting conversation last night about William Jennings Bryan. Do you think he's going to resign as Secretary of State? Who do you think will take his place? Maybe you should appoint me. Wait, what? He's just proposed marriage. And she's suggesting herself as Secretary of State before women could vote nationwide. So she, even though she didn't have a political background, she clearly is fascinated and she really wants to be an insider. And he finally did catch on about the flirting by policy analysis. So he didn't stop with the kiss your eyelid stuff, but he started adding more detail about what he was working on. And it wasn't patronizing. He wasn't sort of saying, oh, pretty girl, here's this important stuff. I'm just, keeping you happy. He really did come to trust her judgment, really kind of above all others. He was not a man who had a large cabinet of advisors. He had a couple of close confidants, and she, over that course of that summer of 1915, really became the person whose judgment he trusted the most.
And it wasn't that she was gunning to be the first lady. In fact, when he first proposed, she basically said that they would get married, but only if he lost his.
If he lost, right? Yeah, I'll marry you if you lose.
Yeah.
And I think that, every so often you'll read an interpretation of that summer where people say, oh, she was just doing that Southern thing of saying no to be coy. I don't think that's fair at all. She had a lot to give up. She was this independent woman in control of her own life and her own wealth. And she would have given up a lot to marry anybody, but certainly to marry the president of the United States. And she would never have privacy again. And she very much worried that people would think she wanted, as she said, to marry the office, not the man, and accuse her of being a social climber. Not a gold digger, because she had money and he didn't, but a social climber. And so she said, I'll marry you if you lose. He didn't really seem to hear that. He seemed to hear, I'll marry you, and started telling everyone they were engaged. Finally, by the fall of 1915, she said, okay, I'm in. Win or lose, I'm in. And they got married in December of 1915.
And so they announced the engagement, but it was not something that some people in his inner circle were happy about. You also write
Yeah.
about just a fascinating soap opera of some efforts to
Right.
actually derail this engagement.
That's another banana story. So there was some concern, even though the 19th Amendment hadn't been ratified yet and women weren't voting nationwide, there were more states enfranchising women, especially in the West, which were considered critical electoral pockets. And there was some concern within the Wilson administration that women voters would vote against him in 1916 because he had moved on from Ellen too fast, that it was distasteful that he was not giving his first wife the memory she deserved. And they concocted this completely harebrained plot to pretend that a former friend of Woodrow's was going to publish her letters from him and that those letters were inappropriate. This woman's name was Mary Hulbert Peck. It is not clear whether Wilson had an actual affair with her or just wrote some indiscreet letters back and forth, but it had actually, and I love this, it had come up as a potential campaign issue in 1912. And Teddy Roosevelt wouldn't use it because he thought no one would believe it because Wilson was such a nerd. And he said, you know, no one will cast as a Romeo a man who looks and acts so much like the apothecary's clerk. Not even charismatic to be the apothecary himself, right? The apothecary's clerk. And Teddy Roosevelt was actually worried it might make people like Wilson more. And so these letters had been sort of floating around, and people within the Wilson administration, his own advisors, floated this rumor that Mary Peck was going to go public with her letters if he got engaged in a fit of jealousy. It was totally not true, and he felt pretty confident that the letters weren't that damaging anyway. But when he got wind of this, he went to Edith and said, this might happen and I'm so ashamed of it and you don't deserve this. And if you want to break off our engagement, I understand. I'll be heartbroken, but I'll understand. This isn't your problem and I'm so sorry it's falling on your shoulders. And he never knew that the rumor was started by his own people. And that was sort of the moment.
Son-in-law, right?
Yes, William McAdoo. His daughter, Nell, who was the third person in that picture at the races, had married his Secretary of the Treasury. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And so here's the engagement publicity photo.
Yeah, this is one of the many sort of photo montages that was published in the paper once the engagement went public in the fall of 1915.
And how was it received by the public, this engagement?
Beautifully. I mean, any concern that he had moved on too quickly, any worry that it was improper was absolutely unfounded. They loved her. They loved seeing him happy. They loved love. You know, all of the columns talked about what an appropriate match she was and how it was nice to have life back in the White House. And, you know, Mrs. Galt will bring a social status to the White House that it's been sorely lacking. Ellen Wilson, his first wife, First Lady was not her natural habitat. Let's put it that way. She was much more comfortable in academia where they had been, and when he was president of Princeton. When they came here to Washington, the gossip columns made fun of her clothes and her hair, and she was shy. Yeah, this is Ellen. So this is the daughters from the left side of your screen. That's Jessie, the middle daughter, the first wife, Ellen Wilson, Nell, the youngest daughter. I'm sorry, that's Margaret on the left, Ellen, Nell, Jessie, and the president, just before he got elected in 1912. And Ellen Wilson just wasn't good at that public example role of First Lady, and she really hated it. And so she hadn't done a ton of entertaining. She wasn't out in public a lot. And so when this, you know, stylish, beautiful younger woman came on the scene, the press was very eager to see a lively White House again.
I wanted to go back because you mentioned suffrage, and I know we even have a question about this in the queue, and I wanted to ask you anyway. Not supportive, Edith Wilson. You would think that, given all we've just discussed, she would be. Explain that kind of obvious contradiction.
Oh, Betsy, I wish I could. I mean, so she, you know, she's this small business owner. She has gotten herself out of her small Appalachian town and become a woman of substance in Gilded Age, Washington. She was the first woman in Washington to get a driver's license. She was sort of known for tooling around town in her little electric car. So she's in many ways showing her independence and trailblazing spirit, and yet did not actually think women should exercise their full rights as citizens. She never said why she was anti-suffrage. She never gave any interviews at all. I think some of it was just kind of a class thing, that she felt that the suffrage activists were a little not nice. Oh, here she is in her electric car. So these little electric cars, I will take a sidebar here because this was one of those research rabbit holes I fell completely down. Early electric cars were very much marketed to urban wealthy women because they weren't stinky and smoky and you didn't have to crank them. And so they had like bud vases on the dashboard and vanity cases built into them. And that's Edith driving hers. And you can see she's steering it by this kind of a tiller on the bench.
Yeah, what is that? It's like a
Yeah, that was how you drove a little electric car. I mean, it's basically a golf cart, top speed 13 miles an hour. But if you lived here in Washington, she lived in DuPont Circle. Her store was on Pennsylvania Avenue, and she zipped around town in her little electric buggy. That was an independent way to get around. And when you read memoirs of the time, people like Alice Roosevelt Longworth also drove a little electric car. It was sort of a status symbol. So back to suffrage. Sorry, thank you for letting me take that detour. I think there was something that felt a little just not nice, a little unfeminine about those suffrage activists. Now, and certainly once the National Women's Party started picketing the White House in 1917 and very directly criticizing the president, Edith really hated that. You know, had she wanted social cover for being part of the suffrage movement, she could have had it. There were plenty of fancy society ladies in the movement, including people like Daisy Harriman, who were actively involved in the Wilson administration. But, you know, the anti-suffrage voices included a lot of women, and they included women who, on just a very sort of basic level, said, we are the leaders of the private sphere. We raise the children. We run the household. That's vitally important. And wanting to get involved in the public sphere, the men's sphere, denigrates the importance of the private sphere somehow, undermines how vital our role really is. And, you know, you heard an echo of that argument 50 years later with the ERA. And I think that's where Edith was coming from. There just felt something inappropriate, not feminine, not the way she was raised about suffrage. But yeah, it just, you wonder, how is it that you could be leading this life and forming a role for yourself against social norms in so many ways, and yet stopping short of this one thing?
And you alluded to a little bit of her upbringing, but just tell us, you know, how she was raised, the story of her grandmother's small town, and how she was brought up.
So she was born in 1872 in Wytheville, Virginia. So Reconstruction era Virginia. Wytheville is in the southwest part of the state in the Appalachian foothills. And she was, as I mentioned, the sixth of 9 children. And also in this little house, sort of a series of storefronts on Main Street in Wytheville with a level above them where the family lived. And so 9 kids, the parents, 2 grandmothers, an aunt, a cousin, various other cousins who would stay for a while. Her father was a judge. There would be law students coming to hang around him. It was crowded. It was crowded in there. And she very easily could have gotten lost in that shuffle. 3 of the 9 kids were girls, and Edith's mother and her mother's mother were very much training up the girls in that cult of true womanhood Victorian ideal that women should be, the 4 principles are purity, piousness, submissiveness, and domesticity, that is what an ideal woman embodies, and that is what you should do. But meanwhile, her other grandmother, her father's mother, Grandmother Bowling, singled her out as a favorite and said, you are smart. You can voice your own opinions. You can have your own confidence in, you know, what you will achieve in this world. And Grandmother Bowling was as far as I can tell, terrifying. She was tiny and she wore full on Civil War hoop skirts and, one of those mourning brooches made of human hair. And she sat in this rocking chair, and the back of the rocking chair had the tanned skin of a dead dog on. I mean, it was just so gothic and weird. And she kind of reigned from this rocking chair throne.
Here.
Yeah, it's such a Whistler's mother image, right? And she terrorized her grandchildren from that rocking chair, except Edith. I mean, she kind of terrorized Edith too and made her take care of her canaries and other things. But Grandmother Bowling was there telling Edith, trust yourself, trust your own opinions. You have earned your confidence. And I don't want to do a lot of psychoanalysis of somebody 150 years after their birth, but I do think that those conflicting lessons explain a lot of Edith, because she by nature was much more inclined to the lessons of confidence and strength, but she felt the need to cloak them in these ideals of submissiveness and domesticity. And so throughout her life, you sort of see her relying on her own judgment and standing on her own 2 feet and pretending she's not, right? Pretending that she's doing it in the service of something else, usually a man. This is her at 18, just as she was leaving with Phil to move to Washington.
That tiny little waist.
And I look at how beautiful she is. And she found a way to become the woman she kind of dreamed of being when she got to Washington. And, 1890s Washington was just booming. It was the Gilded Age. There's huge public works going on. If you can play sort of Gilded Age mansion as you drive up one Massachusetts Avenue these days. And she didn't have any money, but she did take advantage of this sort of city on the move, right? She was always at the theater. She became very fashionable, figured out what looked good on her. And so she kind of became the woman she imagined she could be back in Whitfield, more or less on her own gumption.
Mm-hmm. And then let's do just a fast forward to after the White House, because she had been now a caregiver for years, right? Her husband's term is ending. They after the 1920 election, they leave in 1921, and they're not sure where they're going to go.
Actually, they made a little chart, and she reproduces it in her memoir, where they rated cities on friends and amenities and privacy. And Washington actually scored lowest because it got 0 in privacy. But they stayed here anyway. They were the first family to stay here, of course, since the Obamas have done that too, just around the corner, actually. And I think the main reason they stayed here is because it had been her home before she married him, and she knew he was an invalid. Even if he wasn't totally clear on how sick he was, she knew. And she knew she'd be here a lot longer without him than she was with him. So they bought this house on S Street that is now the Woodrow Wilson House. You can go visit. It's a museum. And he only survived a couple more years. He died in 1924. And she starts in her memoir referring to him as an invalid from that moment, as soon as she doesn't have to pretend to the public anymore.
Yeah.
He was never going to get better, and she didn't have to pretend he was. But then, she lived to 1961. She lived 37 years after his death.
Because she was only 50 when he died-ish.
Yeah, 52. And she lived to be 89.
Yeah.
So she stayed in that house. She kind of went back to being a wealthy widow about town. She traveled to Europe every year and wore gorgeous clothes. And as you might imagine from someone who owned a jewelry store, had some pretty good jewelry, good hats. She invited every incoming first lady to tea, regardless of party. To sort of say, as Anita was saying, this is a crazy job. There's no job description. It's really hard. I'm here. I get it. And what she mainly spent her time doing was burnishing Wilson's reputation.
Right.
So she showed up everywhere. You know, every time someone was unveiling a statue or naming something after him or announcing an award in his honor, she was there making sure that they were talking about him in the way that she thought he deserved. And, you know, it's been really interesting in the last couple of years as Wilson's reputation has been revised and his name has been taken off of things, and people have been pointing out the less heroic moments of his presidency, that the myth we are taking down is to a large degree Edith's myth. She spent a lot of time creating that, you know, hero with the vision of global peace thing that we are now revisiting.
And this managing of his legacy, she spent a lot of time focused on that, as you say. She decided to write her own memoir, though.
Yeah.
And you referenced that earlier about using that obviously as a source, but there's some obvious discrepancies there. Talk about her decision to do that and what you've sort of been able to unearth from that memoir that maybe didn't quite line up with a couple things that actually happened.
So as far as I could tell, everyone in that administration wrote a memoir, and they started publishing them pretty much as soon as he left office. The first one started coming out in 1921. And they all made Edith mad. She felt that everyone else's versions of events got something wrong or cast him in a light that wasn't flattering enough or cast her role in an inaccurate way. So she actually started writing her own memoir kind of in a fury on a train. And her whole mission was to set the record straight. She had a story she felt very strongly needed to be told. She was actually the first lady to write a memoir. Now it's, you know, routine. You expect them to hit the shelves a couple of years after they leave the White House. Her memoir is actually delightful. It's funny. It's frank. She has a great eye for detail. It is also at places like provably untrue, because there are so many other accounts of things. And so once you realize that she is shading the truth in places where you know there's another source, it makes you wonder what she's doing in places where she's the only source. And so you really do need to take her memoir with a grain of salt. So for like her early years, where no one else was writing about Edith Wilson in the 1880s, I couldn't necessarily verify that her grandmother was terrifying. All I could do was understand what Reconstruction era Virginia was like and kind of put Edith in a time and context that helped me understand her world. Same with Gilded Age Washington. Once she became sort of a figure of some status in town, then other people started to reference her, and there were, you know, other sources for her story. The other interesting thing is her memoir ends the day he dies. Her memoir ends the day he dies. She actually did write more chapters, but her publisher didn't think anybody would be interested in them. And so there are these unpublished chapters of her memoir that no other biographer has had access to. But the folks who own the house she was born in, which has a Edith Bowling Wilson Birthplace Museum on the ground floor, were incredibly generous enough to let me have those. And so, you know, as source material, that is like a holy grail, you know. I will say there's not anything like hugely newsworthy or revelatory in them, but it is just more of her voice. It's more of getting to understand her.
And speaking of papers, she was fiercely guarded of his papers.
Yeah, in a way that you just couldn't since the Presidential Records Act. She managed to figure out a way to challenge anybody from publishing any letters from him, even if they were to that person. So like Edward House, Colonel House, one of his closest advisors before Edith kind of undermined him, he wanted to publish this whole, you know, correspondence between him and the president, especially during the Paris peace negotiations. And Edith wouldn't let him publish anything that Wilson had written. And so his book is just his letters and Wilson's are paraphrased. And she managed to exert total control and only allowed her handpicked biographer, Ray Stannard Baker, access to any of his papers.
I wanted to, before we go to some questions, I wanted to ask you about what is now the Wilson Center, which we all know in Washington, and how that came about. There's another great photo that you
Yeah,
have.
I love this picture. So this is 89-year-old Edith. This is one of the last pictures of her in 1961 with President Kennedy. And what he's signing and handing her the pen for is establishing a Woodrow Wilson Memorial Commission. And once they decided there would be a Woodrow Wilson Memorial, there was a lot of talk about, would it be a traditional memorial, you know, something figurative, statuary, or would it be a living memorial, something that was a memorial in kind of name only, but was active. And that's how the Wilson Center came about, that this exploration of democracy and diplomacy was actually the best way to memorialize him. And so instead of, you know, something in marble and bronze, you've got this living Wilson Commission. That's what the Wilson Center is it's his memorial.
And we also have the Wilson Bridge, which she advocated for, but died right before it was open.
The day that it was supposed to be dedicated is the day she died. Yeah, she had the excellent political timing to die on his birthday, December 28th. So, you know, he's buried at the National Cathedral, is the only president buried in Washington. And there are flowers placed on his grave on the anniversary of his death. And I mean, on the anniversary of his birth, which is the anniversary of her death. So often there'll be a great big patriotic red, white, and blue wreath, and then some orchids on the side for her. And it sort of looks like people are saying, we knew you acted as president too. It's really more a coincidence of the dates. Orchids were her thing, but it does sort of include her in the memorialization of him in this appropriate way.
So we have a couple of questions here I want to get to. One of them goes to that point of Sydney is asking, when did the public start to discover the role that she played during her husband's illness in the White House, and what was their reaction?
So it kind of trickled out at the time. They were, Edith and Carrie Grayson and Joe Tumulty were pretty good at the secret keeping, and anybody who did know also had a vested interest in keeping Wilson in office. So some of his closest advisors and members of his cabinet. There were, you know, rumors as when the senators did come eyeball him in December, and there was sort of a growing clamor of those rumors by the spring of 1920, of people saying, if he's okay, let us see him, and if he's not okay, we need to see that. And it was interesting actually to read some of the newspaper articles around that time, because some of them very frankly called out Edith for acting as president, and not all of them in a critical way. Some of those articles said, look at what a dutiful wife she is. Look at how impressive she is keeping up his, you know, his needs before her own. And I will say, just to clarify, the 25th Amendment didn't exist. So the 25th Amendment wasn't ratified till 1967, and it clarifies what happens when the president is incapacitated. So in the absence of that, there's some vague language in the Constitution, but it doesn't specify whether the vice president becomes acting president, becomes actual president, and more to the point, it doesn't specify who makes that call. And so anybody who might make that call, like his doctor or his chief of staff or his wife, was never going to. And so Edith was able to step in a way that didn't outrage people's sort of legal response. It was undemocratic, certainly, but she wasn't breaking a law in the way that it would be much clearer after the 25th Amendment. I will say that as all those memoirs began to be published after he left office, her role started coming a little bit more and more and more to light. And even before the stroke, you know, it became clear that she was a back channel to talk to him in Paris. People would bring stuff to her. People knew that she had his ear. And so the fact that she was a political insider became clearer and clearer as other people wrote their own stories. And then, you know, interestingly, in her obituaries, which again weren't till 1961, this chapter of her stepping in to the executive branch is mentioned in all of them. Of course it is, but again, not universally critically. There are obituaries that praised her for doing what she needed to do.
And she stayed active in Democratic presidential politics, attending conventions and
yeah, I mean, a
um,
bit. She still never gave speeches. She did go to the 1928 Democratic Convention. Her name was floated a couple of times as a potential vice presidential nominee. You know, women that got in the vote in 1920, there was some talk about, you know, if we're going to put a woman on the ticket, who better than the most famous Democratic woman we have. But she never took up that mantle. She was not interested in playing that game once he was gone.
We have another question here. Are there aspects of Edith Wilson's legacy that you see reflected in other recent first ladies?
Sure. First of all, there's a lot, you know, as we've now said several times, it's a really weird job, and every first lady has to figure it out for herself. And she might look to her predecessors, but to the degree that we sort of expect the first lady to reflect ideal American womanhood in some way, what we think of as ideal American womanhood is a moving target. And so every woman needs to invent it for her own time. Edith was really good at the sort of public example part of first ladying, when she had sheep mowing the White House lawn during World War I to free up the landscape manpower to work in the war. And then she auctioned off the wool to benefit the Red Cross, things like that, that sort of made a public example of the role. And then when she went to Paris with him, and they were gone for the better part of 6 months, suddenly it elevated the role to an international stage just by showing up largely. She was in every picture with European royalty. She was on the front page of every newspaper. She was staying at Buckingham Palace. She was right there on the stage when he was getting the key to the city, whatever it was. And so that kind of public diplomacy role became much more expected and accepted. You know, the first lady was barely known outside of Washington, let alone outside of the nation, before Edith played that role. This is a picture of them in Paris when they were in an open carriage. And, you know, Wilson was hailed as the liberator, and people threw bouquets of flowers on them. And they were so buried by the flowers that they had to keep sort of shoving them out of the carriage in order to make sure that they weren't literally buried. But pictures like this were on the front page of every newspaper in the world. And the first lady had just never, no first lady had been that prominent, could not have been that prominent. But she also played that role that many first ladies have since, of making it all easier for him. He was shy, and he was definitely one of those people who hated to be seen kind of putting a toe wrong. He didn't like to ask, what's the protocol here? Where are we supposed to go? He just wanted to be seen as perfect. And she, because she trusted her own opinion and didn't much, you know, had kind of barreled her way into positions that she was ill prepared for her whole life, would say, you know, are we dressing for dinner? Anyone wearing gloves? Should use her terrible self-taught French and just, you know, make everybody feel at ease and charmed, and make it so that he could be that standoffish superior guy.
This is a good question, I think, to end on, from Olivia, who asked, why do you think Edith Wilson's history is largely unknown to the average person? And why is it important for people to learn about her? And then I guess I would add on to that, why you wanted to actually write this book and undertake this project.
Yeah, I love this question. So I think one of the main reasons that we don't know more is Edith herself. Edith spent a lot of time minimizing what she did. And when she did admit to what she called her stewardship, she couched it entirely in terms of being the best Mrs. Woodrow Wilson she could possibly be, that she was fighting for her husband, and nay should be damned. And so I think that version of her was bought by a lot of people. That felt appropriate, and she couldn't possibly have, you know, any real power. She was really just standing by her man. I also do think that stories like this expose the limits of, you know, a kind of Hall of Fame model of history. If we're only talking about the person who signed the legislation or the person that led the battalion, then you only admit to history being made by the people who were able to hold those positions of power, who were white men. And other people affected social change. And it's not even a like, she was there too kind of a thing. It's just broadening your definition of how change happens and understanding that it's not always in the hands of the people who rise to the Hall of Fame level. And that is why I found her story fascinating, is that she was complicated. She did some things that were not admirable. She was not a hero. She was not a villain. She was not a sinner. She was not a saint. She was all of those things, as are all of us. She was, you know, a real live, three-dimensional, complicated human being. And the way she affected history was a complicated, three-dimensional way. And then she hit her own tracks. And so it's a story that feels to me very, first of all, it's just dramatic and fascinating and all of those things, but it also just makes us rethink who gets to make history, who gets to tell history, what making history even is. And I think all those things are due for a rethink.
Well, thank you for writing this book. It was a terrific read. I encourage everybody to get a copy of it. And thank you, Rebecca, for spending some time with us tonight. We appreciate it. And thank you to Anita and the First Ladies Initiative for co-hosting this with us. I want to let everybody know that next Wednesday, we are going to do a program with our partners at Gender on the Ballot about a new poll that we released about 2 weeks ago about women in the 2024 election. So we hope you will join us next Wednesday at 6 o'clock Eastern for that. You can find a registration link in the chat or on our website, and have a great evening. And thanks again.